friend to friend, this is a beautiful piece of music. Why not do it? Like this music that is so deep that it does inspire people like Paul McCartney.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. As Sir George Martin, the legendary producer of the Beatles, says in David's documentary about the Smile album, we all waited in great anticipation for this great album to come out, and it never happened. After the ambitious Smile sessions fell apart in 1967, Brian slipped into a deep depression, plagued by paranoia, at one point even convinced his home was being bugged. His mental health was already fragile, but what happened next only made things worse. In 1969, his father, Murray Wilson, made the shocking decision to sell the Beach Boys catalog for just $700,000. The buyer, a company associated with Irving Azoff, who would go on to manage the Eagles. Brian was absolutely devastated. To him, it just wasn't a bad business deal, it was a betrayal. Today, with artists selling their catalogs for hundreds of millions, the move seems almost unthinkable. It symbolized, in many ways, the broader abuse the Wilson brothers had endured since childhood from Murray. This sale meant that the Beach Boys no longer controlled their own songs or the royalties. As the 1970s wore on, the band faced growing financial pressure, forcing them to tour constantly just to stay afloat. A greatest hits compilation brought brief success, but any new attempt at new material failed to really gain traction. By the mid-70s, Brian's condition had worsened so dramatically that his wife, Marilyn, reached out for help, hiring a controversial Hollywood psychologist named Dr. Eugene Landy. He charged $20,000 a month and took a tough love approach, forcing Brian back on the road in hopes that touring might snap him out of his decline. But it backfired. Brian had quit live performance in 1964 due to crippling stage fright and panic attacks. His real genius thrived in the studio, not on stage. Eventually, Landy was fired for his excessive fees. And unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. In 1982, Landy returned, this time with far more control over Brian's life. Over the next 8 years, he became not just Brian's therapist, but also his manager, songwriting partner, executive producer, and even co-author. Landy charged up to $430,000 a year and claimed credit on Brian's solo albums, including 1988's Brian Wilson and the unreleased Sweet Insanity. Landy over-medicated Brian. He isolated him. He manipulated every aspect of his life, from his career to his finances. And in 1989, the California Board of Psychology revoked Landy's license due to unethical behavior. But even then, Landy continued to act as Brian's business partner until a 1992 court order finally banned him from all contact. Brian's rescue came from an unexpected place. A woman named Melinda Ledbetter, who worked at a car dealership where Brian happened to visit to purchase a Cadillac. As she began to deepen her romantic relationship with Brian, she questioned Dr. Landy's methods, saw the abuse for what it was, and helped free Brian from his control. By the late 1990s, Brian reemerged. He began touring again, this time performing Pet Sounds with a new band. Audiences welcomed him with open arms, and with our guest David Leaf's help, Brian slowly had renewed confidence to revisit the long-lost album Smile. He started playing bits and pieces of it live, rekindling interest in the legendary album that had once been left for dead.
But that leads us to the resurrection. That 37 years after he shelves it, he actually comes back to it and brings it to life.
And that's where I want to go next, is this incredible 37-year gap between shelving that album. And I have to tell you, your book, Smile, The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson, is and the documentary, the 2004 documentary called Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile. What I admired about these works is your modesty in telling this story. You let others tell the story, and you pose those questions that you've so eloquently posed to us today. We don't know the answers. I can only give you the information and you decide. And I have to congratulate you for that, because
Thank
it's
you.
a beautiful, these are beautiful pieces of work.
And while it's a beautiful thing to say, there's still some questions that we can't answer.
Right.
But
Well, I count myself in that group, because I've always heard about Smile, how it was coming, it was great, it was this, and then I saw the documentary and it blew me away. And to see this book even go deeper, it was such a gift. And I guess, how did you, because I think you're very modest, David, how did you get close enough to Brian? Because you played a huge role in convincing him to go forward with this project.
he's incredibly strong and incredibly sensitive, which sound, irreconcilable. And he's easily hurt, but he's been hurt so many times that he can shrug off the pain. All of the pain that he suffered in his youth led him to write this music that is so deep that it does inspire people like Paul McCartney. It's just because it is filled with the healing power that Brian would say of God's mercy. And so we're the beneficiary of all that pain and suffering he went through to get to the finished product. As to my role, I didn't do anything to convince him. I really didn't. What I did was, as his friend, tell him how beautiful the music was. I
Uh-huh.
never told him what he should do with the music. So the first major step in terms of my being involved, other than moving to California, writing a book about Brian and becoming his friend, was when Capitol Records asked me and Andy Paley and Mark Lynette to do a box set in 1993 for the 30th anniversary of the Beach Boys' first hit. And when we had a track listing, I went up to the house. We were going. We were seeing Brian regularly, and when we were at the house one night, I went over the track listing with Brian, and there was one song he asked me to remove, and I said, "Well, of course, you wrote, arranged, and produced this music. If you don't want it on there, we'll take it off." And then I posed. I took a deep breath and I posed a question. I said, "Brian, there's a gap in this track listing." And he kind of looked at me and says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, we have Good Vibrations, the single, and we have Heroes and Villains, the single, but there's 8 months of recording of the Smile sessions that aren't represented." And I said, "I'm not asking you to finish the album, but it would be great if we could include some of those songs there to fill that gap." And he said, "Okay, what songs do you have in mind?" And I was ready with my list. And so I said, "Well, Surf's Up, Cabin Essence, Wonderful, Wind Chimes, etc." And I purposely didn't mention Fire, because I figured, I don't want to push that button. But
Yeah.
but I mentioned the songs, and he said, "Okay." There was no back and forth, like, I don't want to do this one or that one. But what I realized, what I said was, I'm asking you, the man who created this music, if it's okay if we put this on the box set, not saying to you, we're going to do it whether you like it or not.
Uh-huh.
I'm showing him respect. And I think he appreciated that. And so a couple of years later, one time again, we were up at the house, and I had a bunch of 3x5 index cards in which I had written the titles for every song that we knew of from Smile. He and I stood over the kitchen table trying to sequence them, to no avail. Another time I said to him, I said, "Brian, maybe we could get a symphony orchestra and a choir to do this music, because it's just too beautiful not to be heard."
Uh,
And he said, "Good, I deserve it."
uh,
So again, this was just me as his friend talking about this beautiful creation. I think the biggest turning point after that was the All Star tribute to Brian Wilson in 2001.
uh-huh.
And at a Christmas party in 2000, he was sitting on a piano bench with his back to the piano with my late wife, and he knew how much she loved Christmas. And And he said, what do you want for Christmas? And he said, for you to play heroes and villains. And he said, okay. And he just, again, she wasn't saying, I want you to go on stage and play heroes and villains. She just wanted to hear him play the song.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
he said, okay. And he turned around and played it. And we were all just, to use a British word, gobsmacked.
Yeah.
And when it was over, because I was the creator and writer and producer of that tribute, I said, Brian, you really should do that at the tribute next year. And he said, okay. I mean, it wasn't, there
Wow.
was no arm twisting. It was just,
Yeah.
again, a friend to friend. This is a beautiful piece of music. Why not do it? And that was a big turning point because he started adding Smile songs to his sets in his touring after that. And so you had a guy who was essentially what was happening. I would put it, Smile music was being performed and the world wasn't coming to an end. So he reached a place where when his management team and his agent and Glenn Max from the Royal Festival Hall said, hey, what about coming here and doing Smile, essentially commissioning it? He was like, okay, I think maybe the world's ready for Smile. And the strangest thing that happened to me during that period was we were walking back from the movies one afternoon, and after he had announced that he was going to be doing Smile in England, and he said, I can't do this unless you're there with me every day. And I was like, almost like, what are you talking about? I said, Brian, I've got a production company. I got my job. I got to work.
Yeah.
And I said, the only way I could be there was if we made a documentary. And he said, okay. And so that night we talked to his late wife, Melinda, about it. And she said, well, what will the fans think about this documentary? And I said, Melinda, and I used an expletive, I don't care what the fans are going to think about this. We want the 99% of the world who's never heard of Smile to hear about it and get the story. And so that's what the film was, telling the story of Smile so that people who did not understand this rise, fall, and resurrection could go on this real emotional roller coaster with one of the sweetest guys in the world.
Right.
And see him struggle, see him walk out of rehearsals the second day and drive himself to the emergency room. I mean, it was just a very difficult time, but he would not quit. He said, no, I have to do this.
I think the book and the documentary do an incredible job of showing that journey. This man is frightened to get on that stage at some levels. He wants to do it. And it's such an emotional ending to that thing. I mean, man, I was choked up watching the end and reading the end of the book and how he just did it. And he went out there and I think somebody said to him, Brian, once the first note is played, you'll be fine. And, people are trying and helping and pushing and cajoling and gently helping this man go forward.
Well, I think what happened was, starting with his touring years in 1999, what he first understood was that he had a band that could play his songs note perfect and with the feeling he wanted and sing the parts the way he had written them. So he knew he had people who could do the music. He saw an audience who was coming to see him, Brian Wilson, not the Beach Boys. This was an audience of Brian Wilson people. Yeah, there were Beach Boys fans there too, but they were actually coming out to see him, which was something that he had never considered. He had always been told, if you're going to go out and tour, you got to come out with the Beach Boys. So this was a slow build through the years. And the Pet Sounds tours were so spectacularly successful in the US and the UK. He realized that there wasn't anything he and his band couldn't do. And they were incredible. Van Dyke Parks came back to work on some songs that needed lyrics or lyrical polishing. So what there was that Brian was surrounded by unconditional love. And that's really what this story is. This is the story of unconditional love and the triumph of one person over all of his demons and fears. And I think that's what I'm most proud of in telling this story.